Chapter 4, Part 2. "Mr. Stevenson," Stephen called. "Maybe it would help if you kept talking. I think I hear water down this tunnel. I think we're about to discover something important." He didn't really hear any water. He just wanted to get Stevenson's attention. But his words worked. Stevenson started moving forward again. He was soon across. Stephen took his lantern and helped him stand up. Stevenson passed his hand over his face. "Did it," he said, almost to himself. "What a tale this will make." They grinned at each other, two brave explorers. Then Stephen stepped into the new passage and lifted his lantern. They walked forward into the unknown. Stevenson kept close behind him. The passage was narrow now and headed downhill. The ground underfoot was covered with small pebbles. Suddenly they came to a place where the tunnel branched. The main passage headed off to the right. The pathway was wide and high enough to walk comfortably. In front of them, though, the space kept narrowing. The passage sloped very gently up to the ceiling. At the top of the slope was a narrow hole, barely high enough to crawl into. "What do we do now?" Stevenson asked. He started walking toward the right-hand tunnel. "Do not lose sight of the guide," Stephen said quickly. Then he froze. He wanted only to keep Stevenson from running ahead, but it sounded as though he was ordering around a white man. If Stevenson complained to Archibald Miller, Stephen could be whipped. Stevenson looked sharply at him, but he only held his lantern toward the wide tunnel. "Aren't we going this way?" The right-hand tunnel would be much easier to explore, but Stephen felt something about the left-hand way. He couldn't even describe what it was. He just knew that he wanted to go in there. Then Stephen noticed something. The look of the slope heading up into the smaller passage reminded him of something. In the smooth dirt he could see curved patterns just like those in the mud around the edge of a pond. It looked as though water had flowed down from this opening, leaving very fine dirt behind. He explained his thoughts to Stevenson. "It took a lot of water to bring all this dirt in here," he said. "And look how smooth the walls of that crawlway are. Water came through this opening for sure." "Is that important?" Stevenson asked. Stephen said, "No one has ever found a river in the cave. It would be a huge discovery, even bigger than crossing the bottomless pit." In the dim light he could see Stevenson smile. "All right," the white man said. "Lead the way. If you get stuck, I can still back out." Stephen crawled up the gentle slope to the hole. He couldn't see far. The passage soon curved out of sight. "I'll leave my lantern here," Stevenson said. "It's going to be hard enough for you to carry one. Do you really want to do this?" Stephen did indeed. He had crossed the bottomless pit, so why stop now? He wanted to see how far they could explore today. Crouching, he led the way into the passage. In only a minute his body began to protest. His arm was sore from holding out the lantern. His back was bent so low that finally he had to go on hands and knees. He could hear Stevenson crawling close behind him. The passageway became narrower and narrower, and the smoke from the lamp burned their eyes. Now he had to stop. The lamp was getting so heavy. He sat it down for a minute and pulled his water bottle around from his back. He could hear Stevenson doing the same. They drank deeply, then rested for a bit. Now Stephen could see that the ceiling ahead was becoming even lower. Could they be heading into a dead end? Stephen kept his thoughts to himself. Stevenson couldn't see past him, so he had no idea what was coming. Stephen judged that the other man would speak up if he became too worried about the crawl. He had learned from his job that certain people did not enjoy being inside the cave. Some were frightened of the dark. Others did not like the feel of being underneath so much rock. A few were deathly afraid of low, tight passageways, but Stevenson seemed to be fine. He even made a small joke as they started crawling again. "I wouldn't want to be a fat man on this trail," he said. "What a misery." The smooth dirt floor of the passageway sloped gently upward. Soon Stephen had to lie on his belly, pulling himself by his hands through the winding passageway and pushing along with his feet. Behind him, Stevenson wasn't talking anymore. Please, God, Stephen prayed, let us reach the end of this passageway. He dreaded the idea of having to creep out backward along this tight passage. Then he felt a miracle on his face. It was the slightest breath of air, and it smelled like water. All this time he had been carefully nudging the lantern along in front of him. Suddenly the lantern tilted forward. Stephen caught it just in time before it tipped over. They were through. Stephen shouted the good news. Then he gave one last pull on the rocky wall and emerged into a new passageway. He turned immediately to help Stevenson, but the neatly dressed young man Stephen had guided into the cave that morning was gone. Out of the hole in the wall cried a man-shaped mass of mud. Even his beard was full of it. Stephen couldn't help himself. His relief was so great that he suddenly forgot all his slave manners. He burst out laughing at the sight of Stevenson scraping mud off his face. Stevenson looked up surprised. His mouth hung open as he gazed at Stephen. Then he looked down at his clothes and realized what he looked like. He pointed at Stephen. Did you buy your clothing from the same tailor? For yours looks just the same as mine. And then he laughed too. Stephen wiped uselessly at his pant legs. Even his shoes were filled with mud. But it barely made sense to try and scrape them clean if they had to go back by the same hole. Instead, he held the lantern out front again. They had come into a passage that was easy to walk in. It sloped downhill. This time the floor was covered with fine sand. At last, he and Stevenson reached a room where several passageways branched off. The lantern light showed them a smooth, muddy floor. Stephen was more and more excited. Maybe all this mud meant they were about to reach some large body of water. Stephen had an idea. He pointed to the damp ground. If you walk there, your footsteps will be the first since creation, he told Stevenson and handed him the lantern. Go ahead. Stevenson did so. He left a trail of footprints to the opposite wall. Then he lifted the lantern and peered down the nearest tunnel. Come on, he commanded. The two men were powerfully excited. There were new tunnels on all sides. Stevenson would be leaving Mammoth Cave soon, but Stephen had many days of exploring in front of him. At last, just as they were both getting tired, Stephen and his customer reached the edge of a cliff. Far below them, down a slippery slope, they could see water. The lantern light dimly showed them a stream of water flowing out of sight in both directions. This time it was Stevenson who gave a whoop of glee. Yahoo! He shouted as loud as he could. The echoes lasted for a long time. Stephen was just as excited. If a bridge was built across Bottomless Pit, and if the tunnel he and Stevenson had squeezed through could be dug out to create an easier passage, visitors would have many new sights to behold in the cave. Stevenson was gazing down at the dark, silent stream below them. Let's call it the River Styx, he said. The River Styx? That couldn't be right. What did it mean? Stephen asked. So Stevenson told him the old Greek myth while they rested from their travels. The Styx marked the boundary of the underworld, Stevenson said. The ancient Greeks believed that when a person died, his spirit traveled far below ground to the shores of the river Styx. The only way to cross to Hades, the land of the dead, was on a ferry boat. But the boatman would not take you there without payment. Any dead spirit who couldn't give him a coin was left on shore, doomed to wander forever. That's why when a Greek person died, he was buried with a coin under his tongue to pay the ferryman. Stephen looked down at the river again. I thank God I'm alive then, he said, for I haven't a penny to pay with. Stevenson laughed. I'll give you more than a penny when we get back. This trip is worth a gold piece.